And welcome to the Road from Emmaus podcast. I'm your co-host, Fron Morgan, along with fellow co-host Kit Culver. Our goal for each episode each week is to take you on a guided tour of redemptive history, showcasing the beauty, splendor, and unity of God's amazing story of cosmic redemption, restoration, and renewal. We hope that our warm conversational tone and format make an unfamiliar topic for many and intimidating for some more approachable, accessible, and digestible unto growing and edifying the body. This is the ninth episode in our journey through the scripture series. For those new to the podcast, our discussion format each week will be to respond to discussion questions embedded at the bottom of the study notes document. You can find these linked in the podcast description box. In the same box, you'll also find a link to our website, roadfromemmaus.com, where we share a bit about ourselves, the genesis for our podcast name, and provide several helpful resources to help you dig further into redemptive history, no matter where you are in your journey. From time to time, Kit and I will also respond to direct questions listeners pose to us that fit a current topic. You can reach us at contact@roadfromemmaus.com. Before we jump in, make sure you subscribe to our YouTube podcast so that you receive notifications for content. Make sure you hit that bell. We will drop a new episode every Monday morning, so we look forward to you taking this exciting ride with us through the scriptures. Just to kind of recap and center us, it's important for us to understand too that even though the focus of the last several episodes have been on Abraham, we're actually going to be doing a shift in speaking obviously of Isaac and obviously the very well-known incident that occurred with Abraham and his son too. But it's important to really stamp a few things too that we've learned over the last couple of episodes. Number one, too, that Canaan represented restored sacred space and is evident in the scriptural depiction of it. It's also important for us to stamp too that Abram would bring God's blessing to all mankind by bringing all nations and all people into his own covenant family under a covenant God as well too. And then to stamp further, it's helpful to understand too is that through everything that happened and as we transition to Isaac, one of the things we clearly understand is that in the failure by in bringing of Israel a faithful son through he who you cause Israel to be known Israel in truth. And so I guess what I mean by that is at the end of the day too is God's disclosure and intent was always to resolve his children's failure. And in doing so, to highlight the fact that his faithful son alone will bring about the redemption that has been spoken about so far. So with that in mind, we'll kind of jump right in and we'll set the stage to Kit. One of the things too that I think a lot of people are wondering, even as we shift and as we focus more on Isaac, is reviewing the Abrahamic covenant initially presented in Genesis 12, the first couple of verses there, and then ratified later in Genesis 15. Looking at that, though not explicitly stated or addressed, how does the covenant speak to and assure the eventual and complete overthrow of the creational curse first noted in the Garden of Eden?
Well, I think probably the most obvious thing that we see is bound up in those sevenfold promises to Abraham, first given in Genesis 12, when God first calls him. At the center of that is this promise that Abram will be a blessing, that in him all the families of the earth will be blessed. And later on, Abram, his name means father of a people. God changes his name. This is in chapter 17, where he gives him the sign of the covenant as circumcision. But he tells him that henceforth he will be Avraham, no longer Abram, but the father of many people. And as you noted, this points to the fact that Abraham's fatherhood is to extend beyond just his biological descendants, but to people of every tribe and tongue and nation and people. You see that even in the ratifying episode in Genesis 15, that where God promises a seed or a son to Abram, and he says, how can this be? I'm old, my wife is barren. How can this be? A servant in my house is my heir. God tells him to look up into the sky, and he said, if you can count the stars, that's how many your descendants will be. Like the stars of the heavens, so will your descendants be. And Abram does become a great nation as the promise is given to him, eventually in the people of Israel. And yet there's held out to him the fact that he will be the father of many peoples. He will he will draw sons and daughters from all the families of the earth. And that echoes back to the garden episode where you have the result of Adam and Eve's disobedience being the curse of death coming upon the ground specifically. And we talked about how death refers to a thing's inability or its compromise, it's being rendered incapable of fulfilling its created design. And so death now marks the creation, and as it pertains to human beings, it's evident in them being sent away from the presence of God. Man is created for this intimacy, this communion with God. So when man dies in the biblical sense, he can no longer fulfill his intended function as image bearer, image son. And you see that in Adam and Eve being driven from the garden and the ground being cursed. And yet at the same time, the promise to Eve is that a seed to come from her will be the one who will bruise the head of the serpent, the bringer of the curse, the bringer of death in that sense. And her name, Eve, as the text gives it, obviously Hebrew didn't exist at that time, and so she wasn't really named Eve. But the text wants you to see that in this naming thing, that her name represents or signifies the fact that she is to be the mother of all the living. Life will be restored through a seed to come from this woman, and life undoes death. If death speaks to this creational curse and alienation, then life as life out of death, or life as reversing death, will be the reversal of the creational curse. So you're right, there's nothing specifically in the Abrahamic covenant that said, oh yes, this is how I'm going to restore all of creation. But there are many things, and certainly as this develops on in Israel's life as the Abrahamic people, it becomes very clear that Abraham is this focal point in God's purpose to restore all things.
And Ken, I think it's important to stamp something that you illuminated, that this idea of death, so often in natural mindsets, death is purely a conversation or a concept that has to do with like our mortality. And what I'm
Right.
hearing from you is that death actually, from a biblical perspective, is more about purpose and function too. And so when we see it too, death is also synonymous with dysfunction, as life is synonymous with function, right? Like a thing operating and being what it was truly meant to be as well there too. Something else I think that has come up as well, and this comes directly from our notes. And so, once again, we encourage our listeners to really reference those as they follow along with the podcast. But justify the following statement: the point of testing wasn't Abraham's willingness to kill his own child, but his faith that God remained true in the face of absolute contradiction. What does it reveal about a man's place and purpose within God's cosmic plan and redemption and restoration? And then why do crisis and improbability appear to be the preferred tools the Lord uses to preserve and advance his promises?
Well, there's a whole lot in there for sure, and we could probably spend several weeks talking about that. But I think when people come to an episode like Abraham offering up Isaac, the first thing that comes to mind is just that pathos of what would it be like to have to kill my own child? Unless a person is a psychopath or has some sort of huge dysfunction or mental illness or something, who would ever think of killing his own child? And how could God ever, as a good and a righteous God, a loving God, how could he ever require someone to kill their child? And so I think that's kind of where our mind naturally goes. And when we think of even exalting Abraham or recognizing his greatness, we want to think of it in that sort of a way, that here was this man who was willing to kill his own child. But the point isn't really just that he would kill his child, as significant as that is. And I don't mean to downplay that, but the issue is not just the killing of one of my offspring, it's killing this particular son, who is that monogenes,
Mm-hmm.
the only begotten. And only begotten doesn't mean only in the absolute sense. Isaac was not Abraham's only son. He already had a son, Ishmael, but monogenes means having a unique significance,
Mhm.
a singular son, a unique son. And the scripture is clear that Isaac was the son of promise. He was the life out of death child. He was the son who was given to Abraham and Sarah in his old age and her barrenness. So Isaac, the significance of him is that he's the one in whom and through whom God's covenant will be perpetuated. It will be transferred from Abraham. At the heart of that covenant was the promise of a seed. Well, Isaac is that seed. And so this isn't just about asking Abraham to kill his child. What is actually gotten at here is, as you mentioned, this issue of contradiction. You have God who has told Abraham, all of my faithfulness to you, my covenant with you. And indeed, as this covenant implicates my purposes for the world, the blessing of coming out to all mankind, as we were saying, this undoing of this creational calamity, all of that now I have bound up in this particular monogenes, this unique child, Isaac, and now I want you to sacrifice him, kill him as an act of worship. And so the issue of the difficulty of this was that test of faith. Faith in the sense that Abraham was being compelled to believe God for two things that can't go together, because it wasn't just that Isaac would be born, but that he would have his own offspring. God had promised Abram to be the father of a great nation. Rulers, kings, mighty men would come forth from him, and they would possess the gates of their enemies. Well, that means that Isaac's got to grow up and he's got to have his own children, and he's now an adolescent probably, and God is saying, kill him. Well, how can both things be true? How can God be faithful, God true, and have integrity in tying everything up in Isaac and his own offspring, and then saying you need to kill him before he's ever had any children? So that's the test of Abram's faith. And when we think of him as the father of all who have faith, or this kind of prototype of what faithfulness looks like, we have to look at it through that sort of a lens.
Yeah, to build on that, Bruce Walke, who actually we also mentioned in the notes too, and he has done a phenomenal commentary on the book of Genesis, says the following. The command to sacrifice Isaac teeters on the edge of morality. We are left with the inexplicable and exacting realization that faith demands radical obedience. Abraham is asked to behave in a way that is illogical, absurd, and to say the least, non-conventional from the human perspective. Within the biblical worldview, however, such radical behavior proves the true nature of biblical faith. And so, Kit, one of the things too that I think you've done a great job of articulating too is when we're talking about these things, it isn't just, hey, I'm going to think a little different, or hey, that person is a little just, but that you fundamentally are viewing things from a different realm, a different perspective. And from that realm, it is normative, but you must exist within that realm for those things to feel and operate in that manner. Because logically, from any other realm, those things look preposterous. Those things like, why would you ever say that? Why would you ever do that? That makes no logical sense, too. So I just wanted to elevate that to our listeners.
Yeah, and just to add a little bit to that, you see as the scripture goes along, and obviously this theme of faith is a central biblical concept or principle, and obviously very central in this thing called the Christian life and our lives with God. But what the scripture sets out is that there are really two ways of doing human life, one defined by this thing called faith, and one defined by this thing called sight. And sight doesn't mean just what our eyes perceive, but it means life lived, things perceived, things related to, things responded to through the lens of what our natural physical senses, experiences, expectations tell us. You run the numbers and you say, here's what I can expect to happen, or here's the trail of breadcrumbs that I can track along the path and have an expectation of what's going to happen. That's what sight is all about. Faith is believing not what God has promised, which always comes down to our perception of that, but believing the God who has promised, believing that God is faithful. And so what we call faith is most often sight. We believe God for what we expect to happen. We believe God for a promise that we claim based on our understanding of what that's about or how it will bless me, even as we talked about the issue of blessing before and how we view it. So Abraham, his faith is shown in the fact that he had to believe God for two things that can't possibly coexist. And the writer of Hebrews tells us that Abram believed that the way both things were true, that the covenant was bound up in Isaac, but that God expected him to be sacrificed to him. The way in which both of those things could be true is that God was going to raise Isaac from the dead. And in a manner of speaking, the writer of Hebrews says he did just that. But that's a crucial thing to understand about faith, is that really the less we can see how this is going to work or make sense of it, or even see the possibility of God doing what he says, that now we're swimming in the realm of faith. But as soon as we can think our way through it and say, oh, yes, it should look like this, and here's the way it'll come together, and I trust God for this outcome, now we're in the realm of sight and no longer in the realm of faith. And I think that gets at this idea of crisis and improbability as God's preferred tools. He wants us to trust him. And we only really trust him when we can't figure out what he's doing or how this is going to work. To the extent that we can predict or expect or run the numbers and see a predicted outcome, that's not believing God. That's believing our own expectations.
Yeah, like I want to play skeptic for a little bit because I know some of our listeners are like, Kid, I hear you. I hear you and Fran talking and debating this, but I've heard my whole life too that this Christian faith is logical, right? That it is practical, that it is sound too, that it is sturdy. But the way you guys are presenting it too is you've just given me a prime example where 1 + 1 adds up to 5. And so in their eyes, maybe speak to that a little kid to just how do you actually help them show too that our Christian faith is logical and is bounded in these things, but at the end of the day, too, it does not conform to the natural definitions of those things, too. How do you reconcile those two tensions in the mind of our listeners?
Yeah, that's an important point, an important distinction, and I'm glad you brought that up, because you often hear people say, "Oh, faith means checking your brain at the door."
Yeah, like just yeah, willy-nilly, just magic. Yep, just
Yeah,
whatever
yeah.
goes.
I'm just going to believe what's absurd or totally irrational, and that's not what this is. But the problem is, as we've discussed, we all naturally, this is what happened in the fall. We operate out from our own sense of things, right? We think and we judge and we act based on our own self-derived sense of what's true and right. And so when we talk about even what's logical or reasonable, we're really talking about what appears to us to be logical or reasonable, or how we can figure out the logic of something or the reasonableness. Like I said, it's like I can see the trail of breadcrumbs on the ground, and so this makes sense to me. If I can't connect the dots or see the trail of breadcrumbs, then this is illogical, it's irrational. But just because I can't understand it doesn't mean that it's irrational. Just because I don't see the logic of it, I can't see where this is going. And that's where faith comes in, because faith says that the God who is true, the God whose ways are right, the God who does have a logical, reasonable, rational plan, the God who himself is knowledge and wisdom and logic, if you will, he knows what he's doing. I just can't figure it out. That doesn't mean that this is irrational. And this is where faith again comes down to, do we trust the God who is, the God who has shown himself to be reasonable, rational, true, faithful, a God of integrity? Can we trust that sort of a God? And there's nothing more rational or reasonable than trusting a God who has shown himself to be eminently, perfectly trustworthy in all that he does. It's just we have to trust him and not what we think is going on here or what we expect to be happening.
And Kid, I would say this before we transition. Trust, I think we're even seeing through this Isaac episode, cannot just be like a intellectual assertion, but that even going back to the garden, where this idea of the tree of life was synonymous with devotion and dependence. And
Right.
so there is no trust absence of devotion and dependence. There must be a very pragmatic expression of those things too. And I think we'll build that out a little bit more. Kit, speaking a little bit further to what we've already talked about, during the sacrifice event, what is the broadest significance of God's timely substitute and Abraham's commemorating the place where his son was saved from the knife at Yahweh Yireh? Sorry,
Well,
at Yahweh Yireh.
that expression Yahweh Yireh, or often we hear it as Jehovah Jireh, is the way we tend to express it. It really means Yahweh, and Yahweh being the covenant name. This name will really be revealed later, but Moses and putting together the Pentateuch ascribes this name to Yahweh at this point because it speaks to his covenant identity, who he is. It's the I am that I am. Yahweh really means he is, but he's the one who is true, who is faithful, who is unchanging, and so he gets identified in this way as Yahweh Yireh, the God who sees, often translated as providing. In other words, he discerns a need and he meets the need. But this harkens back or kind of echoes to even as Abram is taking Isaac out, and God tells him, just as he had told him, leave your family, your relatives, go to a land that I will show you. Now God is saying to Abraham, take the boy and go to a mountain that I will show you, go to a place. And they walk for 3 days. And they come to this mountain, and Abraham's aware this is the place where he's to sacrifice Isaac. And he tells the servants, you wait here, and the boy and I are going to go and worship the Lord, and then we will return to you. We will return to you. There's that Hebrews writer's idea. He had it in his mind that God was somehow going to give Isaac back to him through resurrection. And so Abram, in a sense, was convinced that Yahweh would provide for the covenant. He would provide so that both of his words to Abraham were true. Isaac would be the heir of the covenant, and through Isaac, all the families of the earth would be blessed. He'd become a great nation. And yet, God would also require of Abram this offering of this son to him, offering representing Abram totally giving over this son to Yahweh and his purposes and his covenant. And Yahweh was going to provide for that. This incompatibility or contradiction of requirement, and the way in which that worked itself out, as you know, Abraham raises the knife. The way the text reads, he was fully committed. In his mind, he had sacrificed Isaac. He wasn't kind of holding back and saying, God, do I really have to do this? Do I really have to do this? In his mind, he had obeyed Yahweh in offering his son, and the angel stays his hand at the last instant. And then his gaze is turned to a thicket with a ram, and he's told to go, or he goes and he gets this ram, which becomes the substitute, as it were, for Isaac. And that's where then he commemorates this place as Jehovah Jireh or Yahweh Yireh, the one who has seen the need, that dependence, that and has honored that faith and that obedience. Faith and obedience are really the same thing, maybe beyond where we want to go today. But so his obedience is his faith, and Yahweh meets that faith and the need by providing this substitute, so to speak.
On a related note, Kit, too, amid this dramatic and intense episode, too, there is often the perception of Abraham's obedience directly influencing, some would even say dictating, God's honoring of the covenant. However, zooming out, what is a better, more informed viewpoint that also accounts for something that we've talked about at length over the last couple of episodes as well, Kit? Abraham's well-publicized failures as covenant son, and even the need for those things to advance and continue through Isaac.
Right. Well, I think most basically what we tend, certainly in a post-medieval Reformation, post-Reformation world that we inhabit, Christian world, we're always concerned with this thing of faith and works. We don't want to confuse faith with works. We want to make sure that we uphold this idea that our righteousness is by faith. It's not by works, even though it is by works. It's just by Jesus' works is what it comes down to in the way we think about it. But we don't want to ever say that our works do anything to make God do anything, or that our obedience has any kind of a cause and effect thing. So people kind of chafe at this and they say, oh, did all of this depend on Abraham being obedient? But if it did, then is God really sovereign? And is this really a unilateral saving work that God does because our works play into it? And that sort of perspective and those sorts of questions aren't really what's being gotten at here. But fundamentally, as I said, I think we do need to understand that faith and obedience are the same thing. It may be like two angles on the same entity or two sides of the same coin, because faith isn't believing information. Faith is a sincere, legitimate entrusting of ourselves to God. You see Abraham's faith in the issue of his obedience, even as his obedience was not just a kind of sterile, clinical, God says do this, I need to do it. But he was acting out, as it were, his confidence in his God. Just as if to kind of give an example, if I were to be in a stalled car on a railroad track, maybe asleep or whatever, and I get awakened by the sound of the train coming and the tracks rumbling, I'm going to instantly be trying to start that car. If I can't get it started, I'm going to be opening the door and jumping out before the train comes. Well, have I done something? Yes, but what I've done is just simply act upon what I know to be true. So it's not faith and obedience. It's that when I really own what is going on, I'm going to act accordingly. And that's what you see Abram doing. And this is why God even says, in view of this, I will surely uphold this covenant with you. Abram has shown himself to own the covenant, and to, more than that, own the God of the covenant. And God says, in view of this, this covenant will go forward. And that's the idea. It's not a question of, is God sovereign, or do people contribute to their salvation or whatever. Those are the wrong sorts of questions.
And kid, like, it even takes us back to our conversations going back to the garden too, is it's almost like a functional conversation where it's like this idea of faith and obedience. It's like that's what it looks like when it has integrity, if that makes sense. In other words,
Right.
this is its truest expression when it is what it is, so to speak, too. So
Right. And as we've talked before, and this comes out all the way back in the garden, God has determined to accomplish his purposes for his creation through human beings. God created man to sit at the center of his relationship with his creation. And that's why the human failure fractured, it destroyed, in a certain sense. I mean, it certainly brought a calamity to the creation's relationship with God, so that man has to be put right. Man has to be restored back to God for the creation to be restored. So the creation is groaning in its own bondage to corruption, waiting for the revealing of the sons of God, as Paul says in Romans 8. So it's God's design that human beings are at the center of his relationship with the creation and his purposes for it. So in that sense, Abram's obedience, Abram as the human centerpiece, or the human, object in the covenant, now soon to be passed to Isaac, it's crucial that they own the covenant in that sense, because God works. He's determined that this will happen in this way. It's through Abraham that all the families of the earth will be blessed, and it's not denying God's sovereignty. It's saying this is how God intended things to be. So the human contribution to the outworking of these covenantal designs is absolutely critical.
Kid, as we close, life out of death from the garden onwards is a prominent recurring theme in salvation history. How does this motif manifest itself, and how does it help us rightly see Jesus as the truest consummate expression of this dynamic of life out of death?
Well, I think, obviously people's minds would immediately turn to the cross and the resurrection from that. And obviously Jesus' death and resurrection is a kind of pinnacle manifestation or climactic focal manifestation of this principle of life out of death. But in a more broad sense, as we've spoken, death really refers to the calamity of created things no longer being able to fulfill their created design, their functionality. We talked about how in Hebrew thinking, the capacity to act or to function is the way that the existence of a thing was legitimized. And so life out of death is more than just reanimating a dead body, or as you said, moving from mortality to immortality or something. Because even as death speaks to the creation's calamity, it's failing with respect to its relationship with God. That's at the center of its functionality. So life out of death refers to created things, human beings, ultimately the whole creation, entering into and drawing upon life as it exists in God. God is life. Life inheres in Him, and life in the biblical sense has to be gotten or appropriated by being taken up in God's own life in that way. And the creation shares in the life of God in and through human beings who share in the life of God as being dying in Christ, being raised, taken up in the life of God. So man as consummate, man as what God intends him to be, man as life out of death, is man sharing fully in the life of God. And the cross, the death and the resurrection of Jesus are at the center of that, but we can't just reduce this concept of life out of death to that. Because as I say, ultimately what this is about is the creation being gathered back, taken up in a sense in the life of God, in and through human beings who, as Paul put it, have died and their lives are hidden with Christ in God. They are actually, God is living out his own life in them, in and through the Son, through the Spirit, so that they are the dwelling of God in the Spirit. And this gets us down the road. But this is how this theme of life out of death that begins in Eden with the promise to Eve of a coming seed and her being the mother of all the living. This is how it works itself out. And, we'll see even when we get to Israel that life and death for them were not about whether their hearts were beating or not. It was about whether or not they were going to remain with Yahweh in his dwelling place. So, death meant being expelled from the land, cut off from God in a kind of exile. Life for Israel was abiding with him in intimate communion in his land. And that's what Moses meant when he said, I set in front of you blessing and cursing, life and death, choose life. So anyway, I've said a lot with that, but this theme of life out of death is central and overarching, centered in the death and the resurrection of Jesus, but having a much greater, ultimately cosmic significance.
And I would just encourage a lot of our listeners, if they haven't already, too, and we've linked it in several other of our studies, really encourage them to check out our glossary. So many of the terms and things that we're using, we know at times if we're not careful, we will by default bring a natural mindedness and a natural definition to those things, whether it's temple, right? Whatever it is, too. We've even talked about just cultural rivers. It's something that we can't avoid. We all have streams that we live in. We all have things
Right.
that we bring to the table, just whether we realize it or not, too, right? Like it's just how we see and view these things. But with that, too, is we need to be guarded and vigilant about that and understand how when we engage the text, as we've said, going all the way back to the beginning, that we are continually reading someone else's mail and that we must understand the dynamic and also some of the blind spots and gaps that we naturally bring when that happens. It doesn't mean that we can't read the mail, but we must port it through a lens that is proper to make sure that we're gleaning the right things as well. We sincerely hope this time that we've shared with you has been profitable. Once again, don't forget to check out our website and subscribe to our YouTube podcast. Make sure you hit that bell for notifications. And we look forward to you joining us for our next episode. For Kit, I'm Farhan, and we'll see you down the road.